That's the number I want you to hold in your mind, not a range, not an era, not a decade, a single year. 3 expeditions, American, British, French. Each independently sailed to the same frozen continent, Antarctica, within months of one another. I accepted that for years, parallel exploration, the age of discovery, competition between empires, it makes sense on the surface. Then I found something. A single line buried in a footnote of Wilks's suppressed expedition log. A line that his superiors redacted in the published version, 7 words, formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 50 years later, a survivor of the first expedition to overwinter on Antarctica gave a single interview. He described his crew seeing cities beneath the ice. That section wasn't translated into English for 60 years. That's when I stopped being able to look away. Let's establish what we know, what the textbooks tell us, what the official record, such as it is, allows, and then let's go beyond it. Charles Wilks, American naval officer. He departed in August 1838, leading a squadron of 6 vessels. He charted over 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline. He returned in 1842. His report, the one he filed, was disputed almost immediately, not by outsiders. By his own officers, not disputed for being too bold, disputed for being incomplete. His charts contained features, formations. His officers noted discrepancies between what the official log recorded and what crew members described in private correspondence, later recovered by researchers. Think about that for a moment. Officers serving under the same commander on the same ships during the same voyage, writing 2 different versions of what they saw. One version for the official record, one version for private letters home. Why would they do that? Wilks faced court-martial upon his return. Not once, multiple times over the course of his career. He was accused of illegal punishment of crew, of conduct unbecoming. He was acquitted on most charges, but he spent the next several decades of his life buried in bureaucratic obscurity. His Antarctic findings overshadowed his personal journals, heavily edited before publication. What was removed from those journals? We don't know for certain, but something was removed, and here's what haunts me. His charts contained features that his own officers said didn't match the official record. Features he never fully explained, features that appear in no textbook, no classroom lecture, no documentary. Features that exist only in the margins of history. Dumont, d'Urville, France. He departed Toulon in September 1837. His mission was to push further south than any French vessel had gone before, to claim territory, to advance science, to plant the tricolor in the ice. He returned in November 1840. He published his accounts. A daily land named for his wife was charted. He is remembered. He is celebrated. In May 1842, he boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and son. The train derailed. The fire that followed was catastrophic. D'Urville, his wife, his son, none survived. Much of the material he'd been traveling with, including expedition documents he was reportedly transporting for review, was gone. Not lost at sea, not destroyed in a naval warehouse fire, on a train in France, 2 years after returning from Antarctica. I'm not saying that means anything. I want to be precise about that. Train accidents happen. Tragedy is not conspiracy. But I ask you to hold that detail. Just hold it. Let me add another layer. Historians have noted that d'Urville's published account diverges from surviving crew diaries in specific recurring ways. Always the same kinds of divergence: the geological observations, the descriptions of the coastline's interior features, the character of what the exposed rock looked like, not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data. The rocks. Why the rocks? Why would anyone edit geological observations? Unless those observations showed something that someone did not want published. James Clark Ross, the most decorated of the 3. He reached what would be named the Ross Ice Shelf, a wall of ice the height of the white cliffs of Dover, stretching for hundreds of miles. He described it as impenetrable, as staggering, as something that stopped him absolutely. His published accounts are considered models of Victorian scientific restraint. Precise, methodical, dispassionate, and yet. His crew logs, the raw ones filed with the Admiralty, the ones that took researchers decades to fully access, contain passages that don't appear anywhere in the official narrative. References to what one officer described only as geometric anomalies in the exposed rock faces, references in at least 2 independent crew journals to what sounds like structured stone. Not ice stone, let me repeat that. 2 different crew members writing independently both described structured stone, as in stone that had been shaped, arranged, placed, not natural, not weathered, not broken by frost. Structured. What does that word mean in the context of Antarctic geology? It means something that looked like it had been built, cut, designed, and those passages never made it into the official narrative. If you follow the thread further, and once you start it becomes genuinely difficult to stop, you arrive at Carsten Borchgrevink. Norwegian, British explorer. He was part of a whaling expedition in 1895 that became the first group to actually land on the Antarctic continent. Not just chart it from offshore, not just approach and retreat, land, stand on it, walk. He returned in 1898 with a dedicated scientific expedition, the Southern Cross Expedition, and spent the winter of 1899 on the continent. The first humans to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. What did he find? Here is where the official record does something I've come to recognize. It narrows. It becomes very specific about certain things, the cold, the isolation, the biological samples, the meteorological measurements, and very vague, almost deliberately vague about others. One of his crew, a zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. The official cause, a digestive condition. He was 29 years old. He was buried on a ridge overlooking the bay. His death receives 1 paragraph in most historical accounts. Another crew member returned from the expedition and spent the rest of his life declining to speak publicly about what he'd experienced. He gave one interview, to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The relevant section was not translated into English for nearly 60 years. When it finally was, it described crew members experiencing what the interviewer gently called episodes of geographic fixation. Crew members who became convinced they could see something beneath the ice, something organized, something that shouldn't be there. Cities beneath the ice, that's what he said, and that phrase was buried in a translation for 6 decades. The deeper you go into Borchgrevink's own writings, the more you notice a particular pattern in his language. He is precise about logistics. He is detailed about wildlife. He becomes strangely abstract, almost poetic, almost evasive when describing the interior geology. When describing what the rock looked like where the wind had scoured the ice away. When describing what the formations reminded him of. He never finishes those sentences, not once, not metaphorically, literally. In at least 3 known passages from his private correspondence, the sentence describing the rock formations is either cut short, transitions abruptly to a different subject, or exists in a version that differs markedly from the version filed with his expedition sponsors. Think about that. A trained explorer. A man who overwintered in the most hostile environment on Earth. A man who kept detailed logs of everything. And 3 times, on the subject of what the rock looked like, he could not finish his sentence. Either something stopped him, or someone stopped him, or the truth was too large for the language available to him. Now let's talk about what the physical record actually suggests. Antarctica is not uniformly covered in ice. This is well established. There are exposed rock regions. Non-attacks, they are called, where geology is accessible, where you can examine the actual surface of the continent, where under the right conditions of wind and drift, you can see what lies beneath the ice sheet at the margins. Early expedition members described repeatedly formations in these exposed zones that struck them as anomalous. The language varies: peculiar regularity, unusual right-angle faces, stone arrangements unlike natural weathering patterns. But the theme repeats with an unsettling precision across multiple independent accounts from multiple expeditions spanning several decades. Regular angles, repeated geometric intervals. Stone that, in the words of one crew member whose journal was published privately by his family in 1931 and has never been incorporated into mainstream historical literature, did not break the weight. Stone breaks. Now, geologists will tell you about columnar basalt. They will explain frost wedging, differential erosion, the natural tendency of certain volcanic rock to cleave in angular patterns. I know those explanations, I have read them, and they account for a great deal of what early explorers may have found disorienting in an environment unlike anything they had ever seen. But here is the point where the orthodox explanation becomes harder to sustain. It is not the angles. It is the distribution. Multiple crew members from multiple expeditions, men who had never met, who in some cases were citizens of actively competing nations, who had no mechanism for coordinating their accounts, described similar formations in different geographic locations along the Antarctic coast, not the same location. Different locations separated by hundreds of miles. If it is natural geology, columnar basalt, frost fracture, erosion, then that is interesting but unremarkable. Antarctic geology is relatively uniform in places, fine. But if you overlay the approximate locations described in these various accounts, a pattern emerges that does not map neatly onto known geological formations. The descriptions cluster in ways that suggest distribution, intentional placement, spacing, not a quarry. Not a single building, something larger, something that would require you to step back very far to perceive as a whole. Let me say that again, not a building, not a quarry, something larger, something that spans miles, something that was designed, something that still exists even now under the ice, and here is where this becomes genuinely impossible to brush aside. For the official history to hold, for the natural geology plus overexcited explorers' explanation to fully account for what we find in these records, you need to explain something very simple. Why did 3 separate governments in the same decade, with no coordinated communication, all choose to heavily redact, delay, dispute, or simply never fully publish the raw reports from their Antarctic expeditions? The United States did not publish Wilks's complete charts for years. Some were reclassified. The British Admiralty received Ross's full logs, but a substantial portion of what his officers separately filed was not publicly catalogued until the 20th century. France published d'Urville's account, but the account itself has been noted by at least 2 French historians as diverging from surviving crew diaries in specific recurring ways. Always the same kinds of divergence: the geological observations, the descriptions of the coastline's interior features, the character of what the exposed rock looked like, not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data, the rocks. Why the rocks? 3 nations, no shared communication, all suppressing the same category of information. The official explanation does not just strain here, it collapses entirely. Because for this to be coincidence, you would need to believe that 3 separate governments operating in competitive isolation all independently decided that the geological features of Antarctica were too sensitive to publish accurately, for reasons none of them ever formally articulated, within the same 20-year window. Or something else, something they all saw, or were told about, that required the same response. Now I have to be honest about the limits of what I can demonstrate versus what I can only gesture toward. There is a body of research, not fringe research, not anonymous internet speculation, but work by architectural historians, by geographers, by scholars of cartographic anomalies that has been quietly building a case for the existence of a prior world-spanning civilization. A civilization whose reach was substantially broader, and whose erasure was substantially more deliberate than mainstream history acknowledges. You will have encountered this material under various names: the maps produced before formal exploration. The Piri Reis map, the Oronteus Finaeus map, maps that appear to depict Antarctic coastlines with a specificity that should not have been possible. Coastlines that match subglacial topography only confirmed by 20th century sonar. Coastlines depicted without the ice that now covers them. How? The standard answer is that these maps were copied from older sources, possibly compiled from explorers whose records are now lost. But that answer is itself an admission. It admits that there existed cartographic knowledge of Antarctica before the expeditions we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there, had mapped it, had left records detailed enough that European cartographers in the 16th century could reproduce them with recognizable accuracy. It just does not ask who, and here is where the thread from 1840 connects to something much larger. If there existed, at some point prior to recorded history, prior to the history we are permitted to access, a civilization operating at a scale capable of worldwide presence, capable of construction, in extreme environments, capable of leaving traces in the rock that would still be visible to 19th century naval officers even through accumulated centuries of ice and weathering, then the question is not whether Antarctica was inhabited. The question is when it stopped being inhabited. And the question after that is why the record of its habitation was so thoroughly, so consistently, so globally erased. Not suppressed in one country, not buried by one government, erased across languages, across archives, across the official histories of nations that have spent centuries in competition with each other, and yet somehow arrived at the same silence on this single subject. That uniformity of silence is itself a form of evidence, because silence at scale requires coordination, and coordination at that scale requires either a single authority or a shared understanding so profound that no one needs to be told to stay silent. They already know that some truths, if spoken, would unravel everything. I want to return to the human element for a moment. This is not just an archival mystery, it is a story about what these expeditions did to the men on them. The rate of psychological distress among early Antarctic expedition crews is not something widely discussed in mainstream historical literature, but it is documented. Multiple crew members from the Wilks expedition were described in ship records as suffering from what the surgeons of the day called polar madness, a broad diagnosis that covered everything from simple cabin fever to episodes of acute hallucinatory crisis. Some of these men described visions, cities, architecture in the ice. I know what the rational response to that is. Isolation, hypoxia, the psychological strain of extreme environments, the visual distortions caused by Antarctic light phenomena. Fata Morgana, the mirage effect that polar explorers are well documented to have experienced, in which distant ice can appear to take on the shapes of towers, walls, buildings. All of that is real, all of that is documented. I am not dismissing it, but here is what I keep returning to. The visions these crew members reported were not random. They were not generic castles or European cityscapes transposed onto the ice. The architectural descriptions that survived in private letters in unpublished journals, in the one or two accounts that made it into print before being quietly discontinued, those descriptions have a specific character, massive scale, non-European proportion, stone rather than timber or brick. Layouts suggesting not individual buildings but planned arrangements, districts, grids, and they described it as buried, visible only in fragments. As if whatever they were seeing, whether by mirage or hallucination or something else entirely, was the exposed corner of something incomprehensibly larger, still concealed beneath the ice. One officer wrote in a letter to his brother that he had seen from the ship's deck a sequence of walls extending along the cliff face for a distance he could not estimate, bearing no resemblance to any formation he was able to attribute to nature or weather. He wrote that he had reported it to his commanding officer. He wrote that he was told to strike it from his personal log. He wrote that he did not strike it from the letter. The letter was donated to a regional archive by his descendants in 1974. It has been cited in exactly one academic paper. That paper was never republished after its initial appearance in a specialist journal that folded 2 years later. What strikes me the longer I sit with this material is not the individual anomalies. Any single one of these could be explained. Any individual discrepancy, any single redaction, any one explorer's breakdown or unexplained death or cryptic letter taken alone. Each of these is manageable, historical noise. It is the pattern, not the geology alone, not the simultaneous expeditions alone, not the suppressed reports alone, not the deaths alone, not the raving crew members alone, not the pre-ice maps alone. All of it together, pointing in the same direction across a century of Antarctic engagement, across governments that despised each other, across languages and archives and institutional interests that had every reason to compete and no apparent reason to cooperate. And yet cooperating, or at least converging on a single uniform absence, the question is not who made the decision. Maybe no single person did. Maybe the decision made itself the way certain truths, if they are large enough and disruptive enough, generate their own institutional gravity toward erasure. Not conspiracy in the movie sense, not a room full of men in shadows, something slower, something more diffuse, something that operates through the ordinary human instinct to protect the version of history that allows everything else to continue functioning. Think about it. If you were a government official in 1842 and you received a report from your Antarctic expedition that said, "We have found evidence of ancient structures beneath the ice, structures that suggest a civilization more advanced than anything in the historical record," what would you do? Would you publish it? And risk every assumption about history, about progress, about the supremacy of your own civilization? Or would you quietly redact it, file it away, call it a misinterpretation, blame polar madness, and hope no one looks too closely? Now multiply that by 3 nations, all facing the same decision, all making the same choice, not because anyone told them to, but because the implications were so staggering that the only rational response was silence. Because if what these expedition members saw was real, if the formations were architectural, if the scale was what the descriptions suggest, if the geographic distribution maps onto something intentional, then the implications do not stop at Antarctica. They ripple backward through everything. Every timeline, every assumption about the age and origin and reach of human civilization, every map, every founding myth of every nation that sent ships to that ice. Once you allow that possibility in, even as a question, even as a hypothesis held lightly and provisionally, once you see the shape of what the evidence suggests, you understand why the silence is so total and so coordinated and so old. 3 expeditions, 1 silence. What did they find on that coastline that required 3 competing nations to independently arrive at the same mission? What did the rock look like in those scoured margins where the wind had pulled the ice away, that made experienced naval officers reach for language they could not quite complete? Why do the pre-colonial maps know what they should not know? Why did the men who saw it most closely come back changed? Some of them broken, some of them silent, some of them dead before they could be properly questioned. What is the relationship between those geometric distributions in Antarctica and the ones researchers have been documenting quietly in dozens of other locations across the Earth? The architectural uniformities, the impossible coordination, the civilization scale evidence that appears wherever someone looks carefully enough and is willing to write down what they actually see rather than what they have been told to see. I am talking about structures on multiple continents that share the same construction techniques, the same stone-cutting methods, the same mathematical ratios, despite being supposedly built by cultures that had no contact with each other. I am talking about maps that show coastlines before they were discovered, about geological formations that look like they were shaped rather than formed, about a story that repeats itself across every continent, every ocean, every archive. The story of a lost world, a world that existed before the one we know, a world that was erased. And Antarctica, the continent we were told was always frozen, always empty, always untouched, may be where the evidence survived best. Because no one leaves there, no one builds there, no one digs there, the ice preserved what the rest of the world destroyed. I do not know. I genuinely do not know, and I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. But I know what the evidence suggests. I know what it feels like to read these accounts in sequence. To watch the same absence repeat itself across decades, across languages, across the institutional memories of governments that should have no reason to agree on anything. It feels like a door that someone very carefully closed. And somewhere on the other side of it, under ice that has been thickening for centuries, over stone that may or may not have been shaped by hands we have no name for, the answer is still there. Waiting for whoever is willing to ask the question loudly enough, waiting for whoever is willing to look at the evidence and say, this does not add up. This cannot be explained by coincidence, this cannot be explained by polar madness, this cannot be explained by natural geology. Waiting for whoever is willing to open the door. 3 expeditions, 1 year, 1 silence. Hold that number in your mind. Not a range, not an era, a single year, 3 nations, 3 fleets, 1 secret, and now you know. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. You can turn away, you can call it coincidence, you can trust the official record, or you can keep asking questions. Because someone has to. This is Tartaria Codex 777. The door is still there, under the ice, waiting.